Hi, I'm Annette Dubrouillet, and welcome to Chapter 18 of The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 18, the title is actually in Yorkshire, so I've got to get my accent on here, and I'm not even sure if it's really a Yorkshire accent or not. But Chapter 18 is entitled, "Thou Munna Waste No Time." Of course, Mary did not waken early the next morning. She slept late because she was tired, and when Martha brought her breakfast, she told her that though Colin was quite ill and feverish, as he always was after he wore himself out with a fit of crying, Mary ate her breakfast slowly as she listened. "I says he wishes that I would please go and see him as soon as I can," Martha said. "It's queer that I fancy it took a thee. That did give it last night for sure, didn't that? Nobody else would have dared to do it. Aye, poor lad, he's been spoiled till salt wouldn't save him. Mother said that two worst things that can happen to a child is never to have his own way or always to have it. She doesn't know which is worse. I was in a fine temper thyself too, but he says to me when I went to his room, 'Please ask Miss Mary if she please can come talk to me.' Think of him saying, 'Please.' Will you go, miss?" "I will run and see Dickon first," said Mary. "No, I'll go and see Colin first and tell him. I know what I'll tell him," with a sudden inspiration. She had her hat on when she appeared in Colin's room, and for a second he looked disappointed. He was in bed, and his face was pitifully white, and there were dark circles around his eyes. "I'm glad you came," he said. "My head aches, and I ache all over because I'm so tired. Are you going somewhere?" Mary went and leaned against his bed. "It won't be long," she said. "I'm going to Dickon, but I'll come back, Colin. It's something about the secret garden." His whole face brightened and a little color came into it. "Oh, is it?" he cried out. "I dreamed about it all night. I heard you say something about gray changing into green, and I dreamed I was standing on a place all filled with trembling little green leaves, and there were birds on nests everywhere, and they looked so soft and still. I'll lie and think about it until you come back." In 5 minutes, Mary was with Dickon in the garden. The fox and the crow were with him again, and this time he had brought 2 tame squirrels. "I came over on the pony this morning," he said. He's a good little chap, Jump is. I brought these 2 in my pocket. This one here is called Nuts, and that other one is called Shell." When he said nut, one squirrel leaped onto his right shoulder, and when he said shell, the other leaped onto his left shoulder. When they sat down on the grass, with Captain curled up at their feet, Soot solemnly listening on a tree, and Nut and Shell nosing about close to them, it seemed to Mary that it would be scarcely bearable to leave such delightfulness. But when she began to tell her story, somehow the look in Dickon's funny face gradually changed her mind. She could see he felt sorrier for Colin than she did. He looked up at the sky and all about him. "Just listen to them birds. Whole world's full of 'em, all whistling and pippin'," he said. "Look out darting about here and arcing at calling them to each other. Come springtime, seems like as if all the world's a-calling. The leaves is uncurling, and you can see 'em. On my word, the smells there is about," sniffing with his happy turned-up nose. "And that poor lad lying shut up and seeing so little that he gets to think o' things that sets him screaming. Aye, my, we mun go get him out. We mun get him watching and listening and sniffing up the air, and get him soaking through with sunshine. We must not lose no time about it." When he was very much interested, he often spoke quite broad Yorkshire, though at other times he tried to modify his dialect so that Mary could better understand. But she loved his broad Yorkshire, and had in fact been trying to learn to speak it herself. So she spoke a little now. "Aye, that we mun," she said, which meant, yes, indeed, we must. I'll tell thee what us do first," she proceeded, and Dickon grinned, because when the little wretch tried to twist her tongue into speaking Yorkshire. It amused him very much. "They look gradly fancy to thee. He wants to see thee, and he wants to see Soot and come. When I go back to the house to talk to him, I ask him if thou can't come and see him tomorrow morning and bring the creatures with thee, and then in a bit, when there's more leaves out and happen a bud or two, we'll get him out, come out, and thou push him in his chair, and we'll bring him here and show him everything." When she stopped, she was quite proud of herself. She had never made a long speech in Yorkshire before, and she had remembered very well. "The moon talk a bit of Yorkshire like that to Mr. Colin," Dickon chuckled. "They'll make him laugh, and not good for ill folk at laughing is. Mother said she believed as half an hour good laugh every morning 'ud cure a chap as was making ready for the typhus fever." "I'm going to talk to Yorkshire to him this very day," said Mary, chuckling herself. The garden had reached the time when every day and every night it seemed as if magicians were passing through it, drawing loveliness out of the earth and the boughs with the wands. It was hard to go away and leave it all, particularly as Nut had actually crept onto her dress and Shell had scrambled down the trunk of an apple tree they sat under and stayed there looking at her with inquiring eyes. But she went back to the house, and when she sat down close to Colin's bed, he began to sniff as Dickon did, though not in such an experienced way. "You smell like flowers and fresh things," he cried out joyfully. "What is it you smell of? It is cool and warm and sweet all the same time." "The wind from the moor," said Mary. "It come sitting on the grass under a tree with Dickon and with Captain and Soot and Nut and Shell. It's a springtime outdoor, and the sunshine smells so greatly." She said it as broadly as she could, and you do not know how broadly Yorkshire sounds until you hear someone speak it. Colin began to laugh. "What are you doing?" he said. "I've never heard you talk like that before. How funny it sounds." "I've given thee a bit of Yorkshire," answered Mary triumphantly. "I can talk as gradly as Dickon or Mary, Martha, but thou can see I can shape a bit. Doesn't thou understand a bit of Yorkshire when thou hears it? And thou a Yorkshire lad thyself, bred and born. I wonder thou art no shame of thy face." Then she began to laugh too, and they both laughed until they could not stop themselves, and they laughed until the schoolroom echoed, and Mrs. Medlock opened up the door to come in. It opened up the door to come in, drew back the corridor, and stood listening amazed. "Well, upon my word," she said, speaking rather broadly Yorkshire herself, because there was no one here to hear her, and she was so astonished. "Whoever thou like, whatever on earth thou thought of." There was so much to talk about, it seemed as if Colin could never hear enough of Dickon and Captain and Soot and Nut and Shell and the pony whose name was Jump. Mary had run around into the wood with Dickon to see Jump. He was a tiny little shaggy moor pony with thick locks hanging over his eyes and a pretty face and a nuzzling velvet nose. He was rather thin with living on the moor grass, but he was tough and wiry, as if the muscle in his little legs had been made of steels of spring. He had lifted his head and whinnied softly the moment he saw Dickon, and he had trotted up to him and put his head across his shoulder, and then Dickon called into his ear, and Jump had talked back to him in odd little whinnies and puffs and snorts. Dickon had made him give Mary his small front hoof and kiss her on the cheek with his velvet muscle. "Does he understand everything Dickon says?" Colin asked. "He seems as if he does," answered Mary. Dickon says anything will understand if you're friends with it, for sure, but you have to be friends, for sure." Colin laid quiet a while, and his strange gray eyes seemed to be staring at the wall, but Mary saw that he was thinking. "I wish I was friends with things," he said at last, "but I'm not. I never had anything to be friends with, and I can't bear people." "Can you bear me?" asked Mary. "Well, yes, I can," he answered. "It's funny, but I even like you." Ben Weatherstaff said I was like him. said Mary. He said he warned we'd both got the same nasty tempers. I think you are like him too. We are all three alike, you and I and Ben Weatherstaff. He said we were neither of us very much to look at, and we were as sour as we looked. But I don't feel as sour as I used to before I knew the Robin and Dickon. Did you feel as if you hated people? Yes, said Mary, without any affectation. I should have detested you if I had seen you before I saw the Robin and Dickon. Colin put out his thin hand and touched her. Mary, he said, I wish I hadn't said what I did about sending Dickon away. I hated you when you said he was like an angel, and I laughed at you, but perhaps he is. Well, it was rather funny to say, she admitted frankly. But his nose does turn up, and he has a big mouth, and his clothes have patches all over them, and he talks broad Yorkshire, but if an angel did come to Yorkshire and live on the moor, if there was such a thing as a Yorkshire Angel, I believe he'd understand the green things and how to make them grow, and he would know how to talk to the wild creatures, as Dickon does, and they'd know he was their friend for sure. I shouldn't mind if Dickon came looking at me, said Colin. I want to see him. I'm glad you said that, said Mary, because quite suddenly it came into her mind that this was the minute to tell him. Colin knew something was coming. Because what? He asked eagerly. Mary was so anxious that she got up from her stool and came to him and caught hold of both hands. Can I trust you? I trusted Dickon because birds trusted him. Can I trust you for sure? She implored. Her face was so solemn that he almost whispered his answer. Yes. Yes? Well, Dickon will come to see you in the morning, and he'll bring his creatures with him. Oh, cried out Colin in delight. But that's not all, Mary went on, almost pale with solemn excitement. The rest is better. There is a door into the garden. I found it. It is under the ivy in the wall. If he had been a strong, healthy boy, Colin would probably have shouted, Hooray, hooray, hooray! But he was weak and rather hysterical. His eyes grew bigger and bigger, and he gasped for breath. Oh, Mary, he cried out with half a sob. Shall I see it? Shall I get in it? Shall I live to get into it? He clutched her hands and dragged her toward him. Of course you'll see it, snapped Mary indignantly. Of course you'll live to get into it. Don't be silly. And she was so unhysterical and natural and childish that she brought him to his senses, and he began to laugh at himself. And a few minutes afterward, she was sitting on her stool again, telling him not what she imagined the secret garden to be like, but what it really was. And Colin's aches and tiredness were forgotten, and he was listening enraptured. It's just what you thought it would be, he said at last. It sounds just as if you had really seen it. You know, I said that when you first told me. Mary hesitated about 2 minutes and then boldly spoke the truth. I had seen it, and I had been in it, she said. I found the key and got in weeks ago, but I daren't tell you. I daren't because I was so afraid I couldn't trust you. For sure. And that is the end of chapter 18.